Imagine you're looking at a map of America, at a place where hundreds of large cities expand in all four directions, like oil slicks spreading across a flat surface. Chicago spills onto the prairie. Houston expands in every direction. Los Angeles devours the desert. It's the natural law of the American city. That space is something to be conquered, not negotiated with. But then, there was a city that couldn't do that. That city is in the state of Ohio, on the north bank of the Ohio River, squeezed between the water and sheer limestone cliffs, rising over 90 meters within just a few city blocks. It couldn't expand south because of the river. It couldn't expand north because of the hills. And that city, instead of surrendering, became one of the most unique metropolises in American history. That is Cincinnati. And its story is not a story of greatness. It's the story of what happens when geography gives you no other choice but to be different. But different in what way? And what was the price to be paid? To understand that, we have to go back to the year 1788, when the first soldiers and surveyors set foot on that narrow strip of land on the Ohio River's bank and drove their stakes into the ground. They didn't choose the location for its beauty. They chose it because it was the only flat piece of land available for building. Behind them, hills of limestone and clay rose like a wall, over 90 meters high from the river's surface, and only a few blocks away from it, Fort Washington was erected. Then the first streets were laid out in a grid pattern, crammed together in that narrow strip between water and rock. No room to breathe. No room to dream of space. Every square meter of land had to serve a purpose. And that's when the first paradox appeared. That very confinement created strength. In the early 19th century, flatboats and steamboats crowded the riverfront docks, carrying bourbon from Kentucky, iron from Pennsylvania, and everything needed for a civilization taking shape in the American West. But what really put Cincinnati on the world map wasn't bourbon or iron, it was pigs. In the 1840s, thousands of hogs were herded through muddy alleys to riverfront slaughterhouses that operated day and night. The smell of salted pork drifted for miles up the hillsides. By the mid-19th century, Cincinnati was processing more pork than any other city in America, and it earned a less than glamorous new name, Porkopolis, the city of pigs. It sounds crude, but behind that nickname was an economic machine that operated with astonishing precision. Cincinnati's narrow streets, what seemed like a disadvantage, became the perfect distribution system. Warehouses, tanneries, and processing plants could all access the riverfront in minutes. Workers lived right next to their jobs because there was nowhere else to live. Density wasn't a problem, it was the engine. But if you look closer, you can start to see the seeds of future problems sprouting even in those boom days. When everything is packed so tightly, when there's no release valve, then any future change will come at a very specific price. Land, homes, and people. The question was, who would have to pay that price? Let's jump forward to the 1950s. All of America was building the federal highway system, one of the largest infrastructure projects in human history. In cities situated on vast plains, engineers could draw straight lines through fields and sparsely populated neighborhoods. But in Cincinnati, they faced a problem with no elegant solution. How do you run 6 lanes of concrete through a city that had been squeezed between a river and hills for over 160 years? The engineers could have tunneled through the limestone. Expensive, complex, but feasible. They could also choose another path. Flatten what was already standing there and pour concrete on top. They chose the second option. And this is what internal records from the Ohio Department of Transportation at the time show. The decision to route the highway through the western residential area wasn't because it was the best technical option. It was chosen because it was the cheapest, because it avoided costly rock excavation, and because it passed through the area that they calculated would have the least opposition. Between 1955 and the early 1960s, nearly 2,800 buildings in the Canyon Bar area were destroyed. Around 25,000 residents, the majority of whom were black, were forced to leave with very little warning. Churches, grocery stores, homes that had been in families for generations, all of it vanished almost overnight. In its place came the roar of Interstate 75 and the warehouses of the new Queensgate Industrial Park. The city paid each family an average of $5,400 in relocation assistance, a sum that was rarely enough to compensate for the loss of a multi-generational home. One former resident recalled that the city gave them just 1 week to pack their belongings. Their mother cried as the bulldozers waited outside their door. They lost their home, their neighbours, everything they had ever known. But this isn't the most painful part of the story. The most painful part is what happened next. The new highway didn't just destroy buildings. It cut off the west side from the city centre, turning a dense, walkable neighbourhood into a maze of on-ramps and dead ends. Streets that once connected people were now blocked by concrete dividers and the roar of truck engines. And this is something we often miss when looking at old maps. Geography doesn't just shape cities. Geography shapes who has to suffer when cities change. Cincinnati's limestone hills had once been a wall protecting the city from unchecked sprawl. But when the highway system came, those same geographical walls forced the road through the most populated, poorest, and least powerful place to object. The Ohio River once connected the city to the world. Now the highway divides the city from itself. But there's another story running in parallel. One not of destruction, but of creative adaptation to geography. Think about the most basic problem Cincinnatians faced throughout the 19th century. If the city lay in the valley, and the wealthy neighbourhoods were growing on hills more than 90 metres high, how do you move between those two worlds? Their answer was called the Incline. Unique cable cars that climbed the city's steepest slopes. Not one, but 5 separate lines. The Mount Adams Incline opened in 1872, carrying passengers in open-air cars to the top, where panoramic views and fresh air greeted those who could afford to escape the smoky valley below. Clifton, Price Hill, Fairview, each hilltop had its own incline, and with them came new neighbourhoods for the rising middle and upper classes. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Wealth and ambition climbed the hillsides. The hills weren't just geography. They became a social map. The rich lived up high, the poor in the valley, and the inclines were the moving border between those two worlds. By the early 20th century, universities and hospitals also began to climb, seeking space and clean air atop the hills. The University of Cincinnati made its home in Clifton. Mount Adams became a haven for artists, monasteries, and eventually the city's renowned art museum. A university planner later wrote, "The hills gave us our neighbourhoods, and the inclines gave us the shape of our city. But progress always has its price." When the automobile arrived and new roads were carved into the hillsides, the inclines became obsolete. By the 1940s, all 5 lines had been dismantled. Their concrete pillars and tunnel portals still remain, silent as monuments to an era when geography dictated not only where people moved, but where they lived, learned, and longed to belong. And then we come to Union Terminal, one of the most beautiful and tragic structures in Cincinnati's story. Inaugurated in 1933 during the Great Depression, the station was a marvel of architecture and engineering. Its massive half-dome still holds the title for the largest of its kind in the world. Designed by architect Paul-Philippe Crête in the Art Deco style, the terminal united 7 railroads under one roof, funneling passengers and freight through a concourse as wide as a city block. For decades, the station bustled with life. Soldiers heading off to war, families arriving from distant cities. Porters hurried beneath murals celebrating Cincinnati's industrial might. Union Terminal wasn't just the city's gateway, it was a symbol of civic pride. But by the early 1970s, the age of rail was dying. Union Terminal, once the city's proud front door, stood nearly empty and faced the threat of demolition. Geography had created the need for that station, concentrating travellers from a topographically complex region into a single point. But when cars and planes replaced the railroad, that necessity vanished. And that's when an unlikely coalition stepped in. Architects, historians, and ordinary citizens. They wouldn't let the city destroy its own history. One preservationist later recalled that they couldn't let the city tear down its own history, words that reflected the urgency the whole city felt. Their campaign lasted 5 years, gathering signatures, organising rallies, until in 1975, Union Terminal was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The building found new life as the Cincinnati Museum Center, today welcoming hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The station's dome now stands over the rail yards, both a monument to the city's railroad past and a testament to what determined citizens can save. The story of Union Terminal reminds us of something. Geography doesn't just destroy, it also preserves. It was because Cincinnati is squeezed into a valley, because space was always scarce and every structure carried the weight of necessity, that its people learned to fight for what was valuable. But there is another paradox waiting for us, one you can't see, just by looking at a map of the city from above. Look at a map of the Cincinnati metropolitan area, and you'll see a vast urban sprawl. But look closer at its borders, and you'll see something strange. This metro area stretches across 3 different states: Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, each with its own laws, its own taxes, and its own transportation agencies. Every morning, about a quarter of the region's commuters have to cross a state line on their way to work, navigating a maze of jurisdictions that rarely agree on road repairs, school funding, or even snow removal. And here's one of the story's bitterest ironies. Cincinnati's main international airport, called the Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International Airport, is located entirely on Kentucky soil. The aerial gateway to an Ohio city isn't in Ohio. This happened for a very simple reason. When the airport needed land for construction in the mid-20th century, there wasn't enough flat ground left on the north side of the Ohio River. The hills had taken up all the space. The only flat land was to the south, in Kentucky. Geography, once again, had decided everything. Planning for something as simple as a new bus route or a bridge can take months of negotiations between mayors, county commissioners, and state departments of transportation. A planner from the OKI Regional Council of Governments once said, "We're not just planning for one city. We're trying to stitch 3 different states together." The result is a region that looks unified from above, but feels like a jigsaw puzzle up close, where every piece has its own priorities and politics. Yet, despite those bureaucratic headaches, this tri-state spread also forged a kind of shared identity, shaped just as much by daily border crossings as by the hills and river that define the land. And that's where we come to the final question, the one with no definitive answer. On a hilltop west of downtown, the WLW radio tower still stands, broadcasting just as it has since 1934. With its 500,000 watts of power, its signal once reached from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, earning it the nickname the Nation Station. As one local historian remarked, WLW made Cincinnati a household name in places that had never seen the city on a map. But Cincinnati's identity wasn't just broadcast over the airwaves. It was written across the skyline in big letters. Procter & Gamble, Kroger, Fifth Third Bank corporate giants, headquartered downtown, their logos glowing on the river after dark. These companies, some founded in the city's earliest days, now shape everything from the local job market to supermarket shelves across the nation. And then there's the Roebling Bridge, completed in 1866, still stretching across the Ohio River with its blue towers anchoring the city's southern edge. Once the longest suspension bridge in the world, it predated the Brooklyn Bridge by nearly 2 decades, and it still carries cars and pedestrians between Ohio and Kentucky. On summer nights, crowds in red hats pour over the bridge toward the Great American Ballpark, home of the Cincinnati Reds, a baseball team whose history is tied to the city's own. From the invisible reach of the radio tower to the stone and steel of the bridge, Cincinnati's symbols were both broadcast and built, cemented into the city's identity as surely as the hills that surround it. And this is the most important thing the story of Cincinnati teaches us, something that many people overlook when they talk about urbanization and development. Geography isn't the passive backdrop of history. Geography is the first and final author of every urban story. Cincinnati's limestone hills created Porkopolis, the pork empire that fed a city. Those same hills created the Inclines, which divided the city vertically into distinct social strata. When the highway system arrived, the valley's narrow space forced the road through the poorest neighborhoods, displacing 25,000 people just to save the cost of digging through rock. The Ohio River, once the city's lifeblood, became a boundary that divided it from the rest of the world, then pulled the city to sprawl across 3 different states. The Roebling Bridge connects 2 banks, but the airport lies on the other side. The downtown is in Ohio, but the International Air Gateway is in Kentucky. When you put it all together, you start to see the picture more clearly. Cincinnati is not a story of a city that failed or succeeded. It's the story of a city constantly negotiating with its unchangeable constraints, sometimes inventing brilliant solutions, sometimes offloading devastating consequences onto its least powerful people. Cincinnati's hills and river wouldn't let it be ordinary, and that is both its strength and its tragedy. But the story doesn't end there. Cincinnati's hills and river are still orchestrating every infrastructure decision, every transportation budget negotiation, every debate over building a new bridge or opening a subway line. Every new bridge, every new tower, every new highway reshapes the city's balance of power in ways its designers sometimes never anticipate. And this is the real question to ponder. In a world where technology increasingly helps us overcome geographic barriers, will cities like Cincinnati ever escape the ghost of their geography? Or will geography continue to decide, just in newer and more subtle forms, who benefits from development and who bears its costs? The city's boundaries may change, but its contradictions remain, buried deep in the limestone and clay, waiting for the next question to be asked.